The court decisions over the COVID restrictions in South Africa are a testament to the depravity or the degeneration of legal theory in South Africa in terms of the current state of jurisprudence over constitutional rights, essentially. You have these very stupid and brittle rationale that essentially, as long as the government has a legitimate government purpose and it's being rational to execute or to try to achieve that legitimate government purpose, then it is said by the current state of jurisprudence or whatever these judges are ruling that then it's not unlawful and it's rational. So those are their only two criteria, and essentially they determine that criteria based on essentially the question of rationality, which is a question between experts. That which expert, bank of experts, says that it's better or not better, or something like that. Now, obviously, I have a pretty good thesis, which I guess the judge would also call hearsay, based on remarks and statements that have been made by what I would consider to be the real experts in this case, which are, for example, Professor Sunepta Gupta and Professor Leonidas, one from Oxford and one from Stanford, who have been entirely suppressed during this very politically infused kind of crisis, which we have somewhat inherited from across the pond. Uh, in some sense, I think, if you just look at the difference in the death toll in Sweden now, which has had its deaths go down 30-fold, 30 times less deaths in Sweden because they have actually reached herd immunity. But essentially, the rationale that the government has the duty to protect the health of its citizens, or something like that, not understanding the scale of this pandemic, is essentially no different than any other flu season. And since we're not going to reach herd immunity before the TB season, that in fact is just elongating the risk. And in some sense, if you want to have a worldwide vaccination, if you want to have when does that end? Because if you want to go that route of minimizing all risk, you're going to have to finish all viruses in the world. Because if you have a worldwide vaccination for COVID, you're just forcing COVID to mutate at that point. We're saying we don't want to live with it. We don't want to endure it. We want to be completely protected from it. That is essentially a biological arms race. It's not sustainable. Now, again, this, I guess you could say, is a hearsay kind of argument or something like that, even though I would say it's almost preeminently common sense. But also, if you look at the irrational measures taken by the government in terms of how its policy and its actions are not correspondent or correlated with the actual measures that they have taken, where in South Africa, we have not even put down the down payment for the vaccine, while we still strangle the economy and the public health consequences of doing so, of locking down things and slowing down things. So, this is not a responsible public health response. It doesn't make any sense. Um, Public health, it can't just be sensitive to damage caused by one vector, by one source called COVID. And in some sense, when you're writing the cause of death on a birth on a death certificate that a coroner is issuing, that's a very political thing for the coroner to write down. Because the people that do die, in some sense, it will be very interesting to look at the excess deaths by the end of the year. Because if we actually measure the excess deaths, and we compare it to the people that die in flu seasons and year before, we'll find out that in fact the death toll is somewhat comparable to just a bad flu season. So we've got, and we forget history so much. Swine flu also overwhelmed the public health sector. When swine flu first hit this country, we ran out of hospital beds, and there was also another little resurge like a month later or so. So, we have lost all proportion, we've lost all historical reference. It's quite pathetic. And in some sense, it just serves this kind of this never-ending political I mean, in some sense, journalism has not been doing its function properly because it's been radicalized by identity politics, because it's used to peddling a narrative now, which is, in some sense, part of the structural corruption and the institutionalized corruption in the judiciary that we have to deal with now, which is that as long as there's a legitimate government purpose and it's rational, then it's deemed to be lawful or not unlawful and rational. And so, as long as it can say that it's rational, then anything, the means are justified by the ends. Now, this is not actually how equality is meant to work. In some sense, you can't say you can't bulldoze my right in order to protect somebody else's right for health or something like that, which is weird because that belongs to the individual. It doesn't actually belong to the government. So, if you want to say that I want to be healthy by having a stroll on the beach, and you want to protect my health by not letting me have a stroll on the beach, and I can say, well, you could have made policy that said you're not allowed to gather on the beach. You're not allowed to be in a gathering on the beach. You can't be in close proximity to other people on the beaches. That you cannot form a gathering because that is what's going to spread the virus on the beaches or something like that. You could have crafted policy to do that instead of just saying no one's allowed to go on the beaches. So this is a clear-cut sort of equality type case where essentially we have to also understand technically that equality is not a right, it's a practice. And you have to read section 9 in conjunction with the limitations clause where equality is also explicitly mentioned, and then you have to understand the cases, especially the last case, in the measures that have to be, or the factors that have to be essentially meditated on. And you have to see if there wasn't a less severe sufficient restriction that could have achieved the same promotion of somebody else's rights or something like that. But, essentially, what is being curtailed here? Freedom of association is somewhat being curtailed. You can't take your family down to the beach. Why wouldn't you be able to take your family down to the beach in that kind of gathering? Because these are people that you are in close proximity to anyway. We know in terms of Sweden that children have have special protections in terms of transmissibility, that they're not particularly vulnerable in terms of adult to child. So in some sense, adults are the ones that are vulnerable perhaps around children, but not the other way around. Anyway, perhaps I'm talking slightly beyond my own knowledge. I would have to find that. But I mean, Sweden worked that out very, very clearly because they did all these DNA tests and they worked out that it only goes one way. I might have gotten it backwards, but it only goes one way between children and adults, which is very, very interesting. Not to mention that the death rate, the mortality rate around children is essentially, it's non-existent. It's like 99.999. There is no, like, children. This is not like a Spanish flu. This is not like a Hong Kong flu. This is not a really serious pandemic. This is a serious pandemic for people that were already on death's door, essentially. And then, obviously, in terms of mortality, it is look. We do have a section of the population that is especially vulnerable, which is why we should have been trying to achieve herd immunity before TB season. That would have been wholly more appropriate. We are literally extending this pandemic into the future when we could have already been like Sweden, that basically it's come to a close. They've reached herd immunity. So we've got essentially an unintelligent plan that just seeks to have more restriction because it looks like that they're doing something that is linked to a legitimate government purpose and it's rational. But we don't have the vaccine coming. We're not in the queue to receive the vaccine. So when does this end? And what about the economic havoc and damage in the meantime? This is what happens when you have no plan. But, I guess in some sense, Cyril Ramaphosa is somewhat beholden to the fact that, Thabo Mbeki was taken out somewhat on these grounds for not being reactive enough to a medical emergency, to a hysterical, hyped up sort of thing. And the press is not balanced enough to be able to actually talk to the real experts. because then they are promoting the wrong story or something like that. So it's this very anti-liberal, like people can actually take their lives into their own hands and they can make responsible decisions for themselves and they can work out, because I mean, really, young, healthy people should be trying to get this virus and achieve herd immunity, because then we would actually be able to integrate the vulnerable back into society and not have to deal with all the other health concerns and health problems that are created by an extended lockdown, which is not good for on financial, as if economics has no bearing on public health, as if mental health has no bearing on public health, as if the only thing that we're sensitive to are COVID deaths, and that is the only thing that is worth mitigating. I mean, this is not a feasible, sustainable public health response. In fact, it's a completely politically engineered and journalistically, let's say, tailored narrative. And I would argue that essentially journalism has developed this proclivity because of its use of identity politics. It's already radicalized itself into this kind of legal positivistic, blunt, democratic will of the people, will of the mob, rule of law, be damned. Never mind that we have to actually weigh these things. It's just, is there a legitimate government purpose? Did they have a lawful prerogative that they're exercising in some sense? Is there use of some kind of prerogative legitimate? Never mind the prerogative of the individual to enjoy their constitutional rights. Never mind their bodily autonomy and freedom of association and all these things. And so you're not allowed to be a responsible individual, a discerning individual that can make decisions. No. You have to be condescended to by a government. You have to be belittled. You have to be the infantile masses or something like that. You just have to be treated like cattle. And there is a middle ground here. Better policy. There is a middle ground here that you say, you can go to the beach with your family, but you cannot be in a gathering, a mixed gathering or something like that. And you define these concepts or something like that. You develop less restrictive means that supposedly arrive at the same outcome. But a lot of these outcomes are themselves dubious, are themselves controversial in the medical sense. There is very little evidence-based, I mean, this is the kind of trash like the Imperial College study, which will never be peer-reviewed because it's junk. This is the kind of hysterical, mischaracterized studies that you see in the news all the time, which is, actually, if you've had it, you are only immune maybe for 3 months because one person supposedly was reinfected after 3 months or something like that, rather than that was actually a resurgence. How many people have actually been recorded as having reinfection? I think it's like 3 in like 50 million or something like that. I mean, yes, some people are going to have very peculiar there's so many different immunological actions and mechanisms and things like that. I mean, most people are actually covered from the fact that they've had some kind of coronavirus in the last 5 years. That only some people develop that form of immunity, because immunity is not across the board. Immunity is not cookie cutter generic in some sense. There are at least 7 or 8, there are lots of different immunities, which is why even half the population will probably never be symptomatic when they have it, which also begs the question, how can we even hope to control something when at least half the people that could be spreading this thing are completely asymptomatic? So it just shows you the kind of the vanity of trying to essentially, it's like Charlemagne trying to command the tides. Exactly. Is exactly what this sort of thing is. It's vanity, it's unsustainable. The statistics themselves, when looked at soberly, I think will paint a picture when you actually compare different countries. I mean, yes, it's true that Sweden wasn't the perfect ideal case, which we are reminded by every time you bring this up in conversation because of the stupid journalism about Sweden. Because yes, in their governmental bureaucratic system, you had administrators who let the virus in to their care home facilities. Their public care homes were not brought up to spec in terms of having protocols and in terms of protecting their wards. But that had nothing to do with the people that crafted the general response to COVID. Public health experts do not gain absolute command over every department within a government in some sense. And everyone is expected, so that was a mess up. That was a mess up that was replicated in many different countries. That mess up was replicated in Britain. It was replicated in New York, where regulation around care homes led to egregious loss of life that was completely avoidable if people were just more level-headed and common sense. So yes, that was a blight on the Swedish example, as it were. But in some sense, if you factor that out and you just look at the general population, or even if you factor that in, Sweden is still in a better position than the rest of Europe. So when we actually take it in the round, even if you want to mark that against Sweden, which I do think is slightly unfair to do so, but even if you do, Sweden still comes out better. Okay, so look, obviously it's a different population. In some sense, South Africa is a bit of a mixed bag because we don't have as many elderly people as the rest of the world does, but we also have HIV and AIDS. So in some sense, I would say it probably, look, I mean, I can't obviously say anything without the right amount of caveat or whatever. This is somewhat conjecture on my part, but I would hazard that we're roughly about the same level because, this is what happened during swine flu. I mean, really, what is the difference between the HIV prevalence rate now and when we had swine flu? So yes, it does lead to complications. But I mean, everywhere. I mean, when Obama was president and they had swine flu, the hospitals in America were overrun and ran out of hospital beds. Did no one know this? Did no one pay attention to this? It's just because the journalism of the time framed it differently, and when they reported it on local news, and they didn't make a narrative about it on the national scene. But we lived in a different world then, because at that point, we didn't have the European Union trying to reverse Brexit, and we didn't have the Democratic Party trying to undermine Trump. But because of this collusion of interests or something like that, that then casts its shadow over the journalistic landscape, now we have this tremendous incentive to politicize essentially what has been blown all out of proportion. Now, in some sense, I mean, you can call me a hypocrite because in some sense I think this is a useful constitutional crisis to some degree. I mean, in as much as that it shows the weakness of the South African legal tradition in terms of how it has been abused and corrupted and betrayed, and how the constitution itself has been watered down, and we have tended towards essentially the fascistic side of politics now, which is that if you're the government, if you have 51%, if they have a legitimate government purpose and they're being rational, they can bulldoze you. It doesn't matter what your rights are. It doesn't matter. They have, if they are acting in the protection of somebody, they can do whatever the hell they want. And this, in some sense, sadly proves the rule in terms of expropriation without compensation in some sense. So, it kind of is the writing on the wall, quite sadly. America is a completely different sort of bag because their legal system has always been pathetic. Their legal system has always been not fit for purpose. Essentially, there is no rule of law in America. They only have due process. And the substantive law in America is trial and error. And so, this is why all their judges are essentially magistrates. They're all creatures of statute. They don't get to... they get to check for consistency. In some sense, they're glorified secretaries. And they've got procedural mechanisms in terms of how they digest and break down the law in some sense, and that's the art of their circuit courts and things like that. But it's really problematic because the legislature or the Congress or the Senate or whatever the lawmaking body is in the circumstance, that is going to be rationalized before the individual citizen gets a chance to rationalize how their right could have been less infringed upon, how there could have been a less restrictive measure and a better crafted policy that didn't have to bulldoze their rights. Because essentially their rights are somewhat teethless or toothless because they have no remedies attached to them. And so at some point, a judge maybe puts their foot down, and the only way that they can do that is because they're either utilizing a state constitution or the federal constitution, and in some sense, those rights. Oh, look, I can't make a general comment about the states' rights, but on the federal rights, it's very problematic because essentially those rights are supposedly absolute, which means that they're basically useless, because you cannot have absolute rights without rationalizing some form of infringement against them. So they have to say that no, it hasn't been infringed when it has been infringed, which means that essentially it has no stable recourse, it has no stable remedy attached to the right, and without a remedy there is no right. So it's a thumbsuck. It's a cock up. But I mean, I guess that's what happens when you have such poorly written rights that you can't even include them in the body of the Constitution. They have to be added as amendments because they know that essentially they're just political rhetoric. And so in some sense you have to fight in America for your rights through the political system, which is not actually what should be happening in South Africa. People should be able to win these court cases. The fact that they don't is just a testament to the institutionalized corruption, which in some sense we inherited from the political sphere, because in some sense it is wholly irrational that the president of the country has a certain prerogative, which yes, the president does have prerogative powers in an open and liberal democratic constitution, and that it's right and proper, but that Cyril Ramaphosa's prerogative is somewhat under the thumb of another prerogative of a private organization of the leader of the NEC. And so you cannot actually have two prerogatives here. It's the gap between those prerogatives where all the corruption is basically taking place, because essentially the leader of the executive that holds this prerogative power cannot be forced to say cannot be forced to justify their decision-making processes, because in some sense Cyril Ramaphosa gets his marching orders from the NEC. So the buck doesn't stop with him, it stops with a second private prerogative, as it were, which is subverting the prerogative. And so with this kind of split prerogative, I mean, Britain kind of has the solution to this in their culture, in their legal system, which is obviously you cannot have a prime minister who isn't also, let's say, the leader of his own political party. He has to be the leader of the political party. Now, obviously, Cyril Ramaphosa is the leader of the ANC political party, but there's a second prerogative in that party that he is under the thumb of. So de facto, he's not the leader of the political party. It's strewn between two sort of things. And obviously, there's a reason why that is the case, and such and such and such. But look, you can be accountable to other bodies, and you can share accountability to having to burden responsibility from multiple different associations and organizational structures. That's one thing. But to be under the thumb of another prerogative is taking it a step too far. Because that ambiguity in some sense means that this is why the judges don't want to say justify this policy, because it doesn't actually have a good justification in practice. In practice, it can't be justified. In theory, in hypothetical land, it can be rationalized, but it cannot be justified, and therefore people cannot go to court and actually protect their constitutional rights because they can't say this is unjustified. I'm not saying that it's irrational. I'm saying it's unlawful because it's not justified in practice, and we can walk through that. It's very clear, because I have the right to the freedom of association. I have the right to bodily autonomy. I have all these rights which you're trampling on. And you're saying that you're doing this to help me or to help my fellow citizen, as if we can't be collectively responsible on the private side of things. I mean, it's denigrating to the individual. It's all the values in the Constitution have been fundamentally betrayed by this degeneration of legal theory, essentially, which has essentially inclined itself to the American model of things, which is right for America to some degree because they can't do any better, because their legal tradition is junk, because they followed they followed the French model, essentially. Um, and they kind of knew that they didn't know what they were doing, which is why they have no rights in the body of their constitution. And again, these things have to actually be measured within the context of equality. The sections on equality, the subsections on equality. Equality is not a right, it's a practice. But essentially, if you want to understand the closest thing you have to the right of equality, it's a combination of two things. It's a combination of laws must be laws. It is a combination of essentially the rule of law, which, as I've said, doesn't even exist in America, but the rule of law, which exists in principle in the South African legal tradition, and the combination of that and equal protection under the law, which in some sense is somewhat symbolized by non-racialism, non-sexism, all the non-values, essentially. That the decision-making process must have not been based in that. That doesn't mean that the decision-making process can't, in its effect, have a disparate impact on different groups, as long as the decision-making process was blind to those groups because it was being rationalized in a non-racialist way. The decision-making process was not taking sex into account, even though the effect of the decision might have a disproportionate impact on different different categorical profiles or whatever. So it doesn't matter. You don't have to have this thing where the effect of the decision equally impacts every category in some proportional way or something like that. It just means that the decision making itself can't target race, can't target sex. That doesn't mean that in its effect it can't impact sexual distinctions differently. So you have to use objective criteria in everything. Okay, so let me just touch on the first point again and recap this. So the rule of law is basically exemplified by laws of general application. So the closest thing that we have to something like the right of equality, which in some sense doesn't actually exist, is the practice of equality. But the closest thing that you get to the right of equality is that everything that affects you must be a law of general application. And the second leg is that the law itself, that law of general application, must confer on it equal protection under the law. Equal protection in what way? Equal protection to the non-values, the non-racialism, the non-sexism, which means that the policy must be crafted objectively, with objective criteria, which is patently not racist. It doesn't matter that, there's an implicit bias if you use this metric or something like that, because of some kind of historical residue or inherited systemic oppression. That doesn't matter. The policy must work in an objective way according to these things. And then you'll actually, because in some sense Section 9 says that the government has a duty to essentially hunt down disadvantage and ameliorate it, to cure disadvantages, to bridge transformation. So that's why you don't say this token superficial color of your skin needs to be rewarded and be awarded some kind of benefit. No. Instead, you say someone who is not educated, someone who has a particular disadvantage because of poverty or is mean tested or something like that, you have to have objective criteria, and then the policy is crafted to fix that objective criteria, and then in relation to that policy and that person that is a beneficiary, eventually they get fixed, and then the policy doesn't apply to them anymore, it applies to somebody else. And that is how you actually have real progress, is that you're actually curing the problem. You're actually identifying real problems. But as soon as you make identity classification the systemic oppression or something like that, it becomes a tautological mess, because in some sense you're not curing a disadvantage, you're curing racial pride or something like that. You're curing an incurable racialist self-esteem in some sense, and you're forcing everyone to adopt a kind of racial consciousness. And so you end up having absolutely no values, and you end up directly being opposed to your own non-racialist Constitution, which has been abjectly betrayed. I mean, in some sense, the Constitution, I mean, what really got us in hot water was the fact that we had race and gender studies in the academy, and they've been pushing out this fascistic ideology, and they've been promoting it in our society, and it's destroying our society. It has destroyed the Constitution, as far as I can see. It's been completely abjectly betrayed and inverted. So we've got huge problems now. Is that essentially de facto the Constitution is no longer operational? We live in a kind of in a proto-fascistic Weimar Germany type of culture, and journalism is not helping because they are all rabid proto-fascists themselves. They believe in the identity politics narrative, and they'll cling to whatever hysterical moral emergency and panic to promote their weird kind of hostage taking of the systemic oppression or something like that, so that they can demand compliance to their sympathy racket or whatever, where they're selling this false self-esteem to people based on this group identity. And at the same time, this is the exact ideology that allows corrupt politicians to give lots of nice things to themselves, because you know, if you're going to only be awarding people benefits because they are tokens of their race and their identity, not based on targeting disadvantage, but because you've actually redefined disadvantage to be a superficial characteristic like the color of your skin, it doesn't matter how rich you are, you still qualify for the affirmative action program. So you kind of have this very disgusting form of exploitation, which is also means that you can never have a thriving economy, you can never have growing opportunity, you can never build the ladder to success, as it were, because nothing is organic. It's all mandated from the top down, and it's crushing everything, and then they just sell licenses to things, and you just get more and more centralized control, and then they use that to corruptly take even more funds from government, essentially. But in some sense, it's the institutional corruption within the ANC which has essentially polluted the law. The law itself has been modulated to collaterally support and buttress the political unaccountability of what is essentially the politics of racialist pride, of racialism in some sense. And so, it's ironic, but essentially what we are suffering from in South Africa is the betrayal of the Constitution, is the moral deficiency in government, which has been reified and validated by a corrupted jurisprudence, essentially. It's very, very sad, because these legal tests have essentially were taught to our judiciary by legal scholars from America, with their disgusting and pathetic legal tradition, infusing their stupid views, because they live in a country that doesn't have the rule of law. They have due process. That's all they have. That's the closest thing that, I mean, where essentially whenever you go to court in America and you lose a court case, the judge isn't telling you you have been unreasonable and your argument is unjustified. What the judge is de facto telling the litigant is that you don't have enough political power to change the law to let me find in your favor yet. Basically, whenever you lose in court, the answer is you don't have enough political power. You don't have enough political sway to change the structure of the law where I could have found in your favor. So in some sense, in America, the law is like, it falls underneath the moral authority of the legislative body in some sense. The Napoleonic corruption, which is that the individual has no recourse against the state, as long as the state can claim that it has a legitimate government purpose and it's acting rationally. And I'm telling you now that American test is not the test for unlawfulness in the South African system. In the South African system, government must actually justify its practice of whatever decision-making process that it had, and it must actually specifically make particular response to the interrogations made as to the less restrictive means that could have been done to achieve the same purpose, and even if the purpose itself is not itself needs to be weighed by the court to be suspect, as it were, because is it worth the cost? what is the downside, as it were, if some people want to take their lives into their own hands, as it were, and be responsible and be liberal, uh, uh, um, and be a libertarian person who loves freedom, who wants to exercise freedom and believes that they do so responsibly. This idea that you can save the people from themselves is a way to treat your people as a revolting lot of people in some sense. And so you can see the kind of the schizophrenic disdain that the government has for their own population with these kinds of infantilism, with these kinds of very denigrating, it is in fact to undercut the integrity of your citizenry. It is very disgusting, and it has no place in the South African legal tradition. But you get this very clearly if you read Section 9 in the Bill of Rights in the South African Constitution very carefully, and you read the limitations clause, especially when you read the last case, A, B, C, D, E. If you read case E, you understand that all I have to do is make an argument that there were less restrictive policies to achieve the same ends. And then I've gotten out. Because you can't just say it's for the greater good. That's not good enough. You can't say that the means are justified by the ends, or the ends justify the means, is how it's usually phrased. You can't just say that the ends will justify the means. That is not an open, liberal, democratic society that is based on real values with constitutional rights. As if people don't have constitutional rights, essentially, that they are there at the behest of the prerogative of the executive or something like that, and they don't even have to justify the form that their policy has taken. That's disgusting. These judges should be fucking ashamed of themselves. They really should. There is no excuse for this bullshit. This is low grade, low brow. I mean, really, we're not fucking lab rats. Citizens are not lab rats to be experimented on by your ends justify the means ideological proclivities and disgusting forms of dehumanization. This idea that you're going to leverage, it's done in the name of safety, so we'll do whatever the fuck we want because you are just infantile little plebs that need to be carted around, or something like that. This is not justifiable in the kind of constitutional order that we have in this country, which you have betrayed. This is why we have the corruption that we have, is because we have a judiciary that is this institutionally corrupt on the values, on the structure of the law itself. There is no excuse. These judges themselves are delinquent in their duty. And I mean, in some sense, you can say, well, the Constitutional Court has set the tone for this kind of trash. And there is no excuse for that as well. But, you have listened to the wrong legal scholars that come from foreign lands, from deficient and pathetic legal traditions that now have infected you with their mediocrity, with their disgusting systems in some sense, we have now inherited the malady of America. Identity politics in some sense was solved in law in South Africa, but we have imported the sickness to our lands because we have betrayed our own constitution, because we did not remove the race and gender studies professors from our academies that spread this disgusting Nazi philosophy of groupthink and morality and moral consideration that vests in the identity above all else. That now no longer are individuals respected as people. It's only individuals respected as representatives of their identity caste. It's disgusting, it's dehumanizing. It is the insect model of the human being, and that is what our legal system has hearkened to in the experts that they have listened to from far afield. And in some sense, all of this problem deserves to be in America, because in America everything is a political food fight. Everything is a political free-for-all, because they don't have a proper constitution, they don't have a proper legal structure. So this is a constitutional crisis that America deserves to have, not that South Africa deserves to have. The problem in South Africa is that we didn't have judges that had the temerity to actually look at what was going on in the academy and say, these people are poison, they are destroying the Constitution, they are betraying the constitutional values, they are creating propaganda that is anti-constitutional, and they were given free rein to do so because it was politically expedient and convenient for the ANC. So we have gone completely off the rails. And we have done so that we can just promote a faction inside the ANC, which are basically just like the EFF, and the EFF itself to squabble over continuing to eat at the government trough. So between the rock and the hard place and this racialist political pride or whatever, it's a never-ending circus. It's a never-ending shit show, and we get nowhere, and we get no progress. We get no transformation because we don't target disadvantage. We target tokenism. It's and I will say that these people, if we do have a genocide in this country, if we do have a build up towards some kind of calamity in this country, these people in the judiciary, they need to be lined up in the docks. When we have our Nuremberg trial here, when we actually look at the human rights, because we had the answer in South Africa. We had the best legal system in the world, and it was betrayed by these so-called professionals who inclined themselves to this disgusting form of legal positivism, which has always gone part and parcel with the Nazi philosophy, which has infected our country and destroyed our values and degraded our constitution, and it happened on their watch. And all the times that they did not remove Eusebius Macaizer from the radio, that somehow he was given a public fora to spew his hate. And I mean, how many genocidal comments did Eusebius Macaizer make? I mean, in the negative. So he's allowed to say things like, I'm not calling for a genocide, but if there was a genocide, I'm just saying that it wouldn't be unjustified. That's what Eusebius Macaizer gets to say on radio. And nothing happens. That kind of hate speech, because it's supposedly intellectual and it's in tune with these academics, these fascist academics, or let me be more precise, proto-fascist in some sense, because they don't immediately align themselves with the EFF, but they see that it's all part of the hard boiling of liberal democracy, which they do openly reject. They say, oh, we don't like liberalism. And we allowed that to go. We allowed that to be publicly funded. We allowed that cancer to spread in our society. To the extent to which the judiciary corrupted itself. And why did it do so? Because it was politically expedient to do so and convenient to do so. So, it's troubling because we have no way to... I mean, I would say historically the real problem with the new South Africa is that we only had a government of national unity for only 2 years, and we should have had it for much longer. But the ANC wanted to be the ruling party already because racial pride demanded it in some sense. Never mind the cost to the people. Never mind that like a longer government of national unity would have allowed them to be more people to be more attuned with how to run government. Never mind that. They just wanted to already be in the seat of power. So what did they do? They said, no. Racial pride is the number one priority. That's the number one project of the ANC, essentially. And politics has manifested in the image of that very poorly construed list of priorities in some sense. And non-racialism has finally been relegated, has finally been destroyed, and therefore there is no check on political unaccountability. There is no check on essentially... I mean, how can you have a government that cannot even be responsible for all of its bad decisions? Outcome-based education came from America. It failed in America, and we copied the model. Why would we do that? I mean, who is paying? Who is taking bribes for this kind of stuff? Who are listening to these stupid think tanks? I mean, it's just, it's just an excuse to do something different, to look like that they're being active or something like that. And who knows what money is changing hands in the background. But it's when the standards of education keep on falling, and who gets blamed? Why is there no blame? Somehow we just keep on blaming history. It's all apartheid. It all happened because of the past. I mean, this is willful ignorance. And in some sense, what's even worse is that that kind of rhetoric means that you can never solve the problem because you're not holding anyone responsible for anything. So essentially, we have quite a regressive racialist politics, which has now been firmly entrenched because no one has a backbone to say, no, the EFF, you can't say that. That's anti-constitutional propaganda. You have to you, you have to rationalize what you're saying according to the values of the Constitution. Your rhetoric is completely poisonous, and in fact, you need a speaker that can actually defend the Constitution. But they're not willing to do that because they're more interested in defending the ANC and the particular institutional corruption in how the ANC and the ANC government, the ANC political party versus the ANC government, have this dual prerogative, have the split prerogative between them. And because they have a split prerogative, you essentially you can't have clean governance. It's not possible. Or that's how you can have this kind of between a rock and a hard place. And who knows whose side Cyril Ramaphosa is even on? I mean, I don't know. Because he has to, who knows? Because he supposedly has to play both sides. So, when the EFF are doing a protest and they're scaring children at high school that are trying to write their matric exams, and he's scaring, and the EFF mob are outside a school, Cyril Ramaphosa has to say, yeah, no, we have to allow a free protest. It doesn't matter the interests of the children, the rights of the children. No. Like these radicals are allowed to do this to children. It doesn't matter because the cause itself is based on identity politics. The whole controversy is based on identity politics. He always has to be on the side of the identity politics. So in some sense, I would say, if he can't ever, I mean, this is the institutional corruption of the ANC. This is the problem in a nutshell. It is a moral crisis. It is a moral deficiency that leads to a deficiency in governance. And because they cannot speak in one voice, because essentially the ANC is a circus tent of people that are just as evil as the EFF, just as fascistic as the EFF, sadly. And there's no backbone. There's no institutional backbone to hold back the tide of any of this stuff, because it's been normalized by American propaganda and American media, which we have imbibed in our institutions, in our academy. So this is what happens. I mean, I would even say, well, let's just have another. Look. I mean, there are lots of potential solutions to this. In some sense, the problem is that the ANC itself is the structure of the ANC is institutionally corrupt and probably not really capable of being fixed because of the cadre system. You would have to kind of just wholesale take the DA structure of the party and use that for the ANC and to make a new political party. But that'll never happen because it has entrenched money interests. It's a plutocracy. It's a kleptocracy. They are too used to stealing money from the government, essentially. So it's a they're not going to reform themselves. They're somewhat beyond. And then you have the EFF, which are basically just saying that, oh, well, you just need a more radical iron fist or something like that. And so they'll have a kind of a corrupt urban elite, and then they'll let the countryside sort of fend for itself and try to make all the poor people sort of subsistence farmers or something like that, as if people actually want to be subsistence farmers. I mean, some people might want to be in agriculture and might like that, but the vast majority of people do not want to become farmers. They don't want to become serfs in some disgusting, they call themselves Marxist, but I mean, in some sense, they are actually cookie cutter fascists. I mean, even the Nazis were literally the German Socialist Workers' Party. That's what Nazi stands for in English. The German Socialist Workers' Party. German as in national. National socialism. That's what Nazi is, national socialism. That is exactly what the EFF policy is. It's national socialism. For the identity, for the group, for the family of the state, so that you're going to be given infantilism. And the law has already kneeled. The law has already given the knee to this disgusting form of politics, and it has done so in spite of the Constitution. It's done so in spite of the legal tradition of South Africa, which has been abjectly thrown out the window. So it's a very sad state of affairs, where essentially the best legal system in the world, and I don't say that, I say that as an expert in comparative law. There is no other legal system that even holds a candle to the South African legal system. And I realize that that's a big claim to make, but it happens to be true. And we have thrown it away for political corruption and political expedience. And for what now we hear, I mean, this rhetoric always existed behind closed doors, but they say it out loud. The political hegemony of the ANC and the political ownership of the media in this country, essentially. Because journalism itself has been corrupted from the academy upwards. And they've just jumped on the bandwagon, essentially, because they have no real moral backbone. Yeah, it's very sad. And then you get these weird kind of cherry picked arguments that are kind of post hoc confabulations to say that how they need their narrative, essentially, and how they project identity politics onto people as their excuse. I mean, I've got particular critiques of some constitutional court rulings and things like that, which I think explore this quite well in terms of how, for example, the public protector was protected by the constitutional court for her what you could say her lack of how officials can be protected from not performing the function of their office uh, because they've taken legal advice, when in fact their whole office is about being responsible for the decision making and the legal actions that the office takes, especially in the case of the public protector. I mean, the public protector being protected by the constitutional court is somewhat perverse. Anyway, I'm not going to rehash that whole thing, but the actual rationale of the judgment, or of the questions being asked, was so, it just shows the ideological corruption of the jurisprudence itself. We need we need a review, um, in probably from some independent body, perhaps, or I mean, from the appellate division. We need a review, um, or at least perhaps we need multiple branches to make independent reviews, and then boards. We need review boards, and then we need to maybe compile the different review boards. But perhaps each. But yeah, I don't know what they call it. We need a new convention. Uh, I mean, there hasn't been. I can't remember all the technical words, but there hasn't been. I mean, I don't know when the last cycle was in terms of having a law review on these kinds of matters. But we need a new law review, and that leads to a new convention that cuts away this poison that we have, that has crept into the law, and it also outlines how we can essentially sue these academics, or essentially for constitutional damages, but also how we can essentially have them removed from academia so that they do not receive public funds, and how we can clean up these departments, essentially, that have been infused with this Nazi sociological moral corruption, where essentially, it's gotten into everything. It's gotten ridiculous, but essentially, this anti-constitutional, anti practice of equality, this new flavor of reinterpreted, reheated social justice that has nothing to do with non-racialism, which is anti-non-racialism, which is fundamentally racialistic. And somehow this gets a free pass in a constitutional supreme uh, uh, I mean, it's fine if people want to do strange things overseas, but in the municipal legal setting, you cannot allow the Supreme Constitution to be undercut with public funds and poisoning the minds of young people. It's pathetic. I mean, so much so that they can't even they actually are uneducating themselves. I mean, this is why, for example, the Keegan stages, why they say essentially you cannot reach the developmental level anymore of Keegan stage 4 with a liberal arts degree anymore. You're still stuck at stage 3. They have actually made people more stupid and pathetic. You've made it impossible for people to systematize their understanding. What they think is systematizing an understanding is just a narrative, is just a mythology, is just a kind of racialist, blood and soil type of moral superiority. I mean, in some sense, it's completely indistinguishable from Nazi philosophy. It's just that Nazi philosophy talked about genetic superiority, and they talk about moral superiority that they inherit from history. That somehow they, it's it's just slightly different window dressing, but it's the same poison. Anyway, I'm ranting now. Let me stop this recording.